Good morning. Thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers and the funders for bringing us all together here for a weekend of what I found to be very stimulating discussions and a couple of years of ongoing discussions and research into these topics that I know I've benefited much from, and I'm looking forward to continuing individually after the project is over. And thank you all for being here on the, I guess it's not that early in the morning, but still morning of the conference. So my project is thinking about charisma. I don't usually do PowerPoint, so this is going to be a bit of an adventure for me. So I started thinking with a couple of intuitions about charisma. One, that many, maybe even all moral exemplars are charismatic, and their charisma seems somehow entangled with their exemplarity. So if we think of the sorts of names and figures who've been mentioned over the last couple of days and the last couple of years of this project, King, Gandhi, Mandela, Mother Teresa, not only are they moral exemplars, they're also seen as charismatic figures. And although it's not sort of on the surface clear about this, it does seem like their personal magnetism or their extraordinary gifts, or however one wants to sort of start with a shorthand for charisma, somehow that has to do with their status as moral exemplars. But of course, there are also many people who we consider charismatic who are definitely not moral exemplars. And these might come into a couple of categories. One are people who are almost paradigms of the opposite, right? Hitler being the most famous here, right? Someone who's evil, but also charismatic, or at least seen to be charismatic. Idi Amin, and there are a whole set of others figures who sort of get lumped into this category, which makes us suspicious of charisma as something that it clearly isn't just linked with goodness. And then there's a set of people who we describe as charismatic, but are neither, have no particular moral valence. Audrey Hepburn and Cary Grant here are examples, sort of celebrities, actors, actresses, that sort of figure who the term of charisma seems to properly apply to, but neither in a good, neither with a connection to the good or the bad. And so I wondered, do we need to look beyond charisma? Do we need to sort of peel away the charisma that is attached to moral exemplars in order to get at the morally salient aspects of their exemplarity? Or, alternatively, might there be a specific type of charisma, right, that characterizes moral exemplars, and a different type that characterizes, the really bad people? Maybe a different type that characterizes movie stars. Maybe a different type that characterizes, high school teachers. You could think of all the different sorts of categories there. So now I've sort of promised to do a conceptual analysis, and now I'll disappoint you because I'm not a philosopher, and that's not the sort of thing that I do, but I did want to just sort of frame these questions here, and then name the lay of the land in terms of the people who are working on and thinking about charisma. And it's an oddly scattered field. There's not a sort of steady stream of literature on it. Sociologists have things to say about charisma, often in terms of charismatic authority. But when sociologists talk about charisma, it's usually in this sort of morally neutral tone. When theologians talk about charisma, maybe or maybe not the same thing, it seems as though it's always good, right? It's a gift of God. Sometimes, thinking of, say, Pentecostal Christian traditions, right? Charisma is, speaking in tongues in a church on a Sunday morning. Or thinking biblically about the charismatic traditions. Now, these two sociologists and theologians might seem quite different, but Weber, who initiates the sociological discussion of charisma, borrowed the term and started thinking about charisma because he was talking to colleagues who were theologians. He just stripped away the sort of moral valence and sort of theological, specifically Christian valence from the term as he started to sort of formulate his account that led to the sort of Weber's progeny in sociology. Thirdly, there's a cultural studies literature of scholars who tend to be very suspicious of charisma and tend to take as paradigms these sorts of celebrity figures, actors and actresses, and so on, and see often charisma as bad in some sense of bad, perhaps as circulating ideology. So if there are ideas about race, gender, class that are sort of misleading society, though the society is misled by means of some sort of affection for these sort of charismatic figures who make people feel that ideology is obvious and natural and comfortable and so on. And then, fourthly, there's this sort of, if you search for charisma books on Amazon or so on, you get this whole list of sort of self-help books about how to become more charismatic yourself. If you're a business person, if you want to be attract more ladies aimed at men, some of which gets picked up in this sort of incel community, this sort of men's rights movement, which is another sort of story and a subtopic away from the scholarly one. So there's this very scattered kind of literature. I'm coming from religious studies perspective, and I wanted to just sort of sketch out how we might bring together some of these different disparate conversations that seem like they ought to be put together. So in this book, In Defense of Charisma, that was sort of summarizing the research from this project, I was trying to say that, trying to argue that we can distinguish two types of charisma: democratic charisma that orients toward the good, and authoritarian charisma that conceals the good, but they're always found entangled together. So I'm not sort of starting with a list of supposedly charismatic figures and splitting them, into the good side and the bad side, but rather I take my task to be something different to help us better distinguish between the two sorts of charisma that are always entangled in every figure that we view as charismatic. And I want to model this work of disentangling, the sort of therapeutic work of disentangling the sorts of charisma by working through examples from popular culture and literature and so on. I do want to think more, I had to make some choices as I was sort of framing this project in the written form in terms of which audiences I wanted to reach, given the disparate nature of the conversation around charisma. And I tried to be interdisciplinary and tried to avoid the sort of technical discussions in any of the various fields. I did write without footnotes. So I didn't get a chance to engage very deeply with the theological and sociological literatures, which I do have things that I want to say to, and I'm looking forward to doing that more in future work. So just to take one example to sort of give a sample of this, right? We might think of Moses as a paradigm of charisma, that he seems to have extraordinary gifts, an ability to work miracles, famously, speak to God, give people what they want, lead the people, right? Speak on the mountain to the people, get the people out of Egypt, all of this sort of thing. If anyone is charismatic, it would seem like it would be Moses, but that's actually not Moses, if you were confused. That's Charlton Heston, Hollywood's Moses, who has a very particular appearance, right? Masculine, hard to miss, white American, successful, and part of a Hollywood kind of narrative. About what it seems like to be, what it is to be a strong, charismatic man, where charisma sort of goes with that set of qualities. But if we sort of read the Exodus text, we find Moses described rather differently. We don't hear anything about his shirt or what his body might look like. But we hear that I've never been eloquent, surprisingly. I am slow of speech and tongue. I speak with faltering lips. Right? Sometimes this is translated as he stuttered. Right? Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? So there's a sort of lack of confidence, right? Sort of thinking of himself not as extraordinary or special, but as one of many, or even sort of less than most. Teach me your ways so that I know you and continue to find favor with you. This is Moses, asking for help from God because he doesn't have stuff, right? He doesn't have sort of gifts himself. He has to sort of get them, and while God might show him a couple of tricks, it's really the presence, right? God says, "I'll give you my presence," and that's the thing that will make you successful. And it's actually not Moses who does a lot of the talking in this story to the people. It's Aaron who, as God says, will speak in the narrative, will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. So there's this interesting sort of set of mediations and layers of representation that happen when we imagine charisma as a sort of direct presence of Moses, speaking to the charismatic leader speaking to the masses. But in this account, right there, it's actually not just Moses talking to Aaron. Aaron talks to the Israelite elders. The Israelite elders then talk to the Israelites. And it's also not God talking directly to Moses, right? There are these layers of mediation between God and Moses as well. God isn't Moses isn't looking directly at God, so on. So if we turn from the Hollywood Moses to the biblical Moses, just as to try and disentangle the sorts of charisma that might be at work there, we find a Moses who stutters, who only communicates indirectly, whose ability to lead seems inconsistent, right? Sometimes he doesn't. He just sort of refuses to do what God wants, or puts it off for a long time. People don't always follow him when he says to do things. Actually, a lot of the time, they have lots of complaints. But it's not a sort of smooth path of speaking on a mountain, telling people what to do, and then they follow you, right? He doesn't give the people what they want, but rather he makes them want new things, right? Rather than fulfilling desires, it's sort of constituting new desires. It seems like an important element, and it seems like his power comes from something about his self or God that's beyond his characteristics or beyond his dispositions. It's not like he has a set of virtues or he has a set of characteristics that make him charismatic. There's something about who he is rather than what he is. It might be one way to put it, right? About a sort of self beyond attributes that seems like it is sort of the motivating force there, and God sort of being imaged in him through who he is rather than what he is. And Moses is unsuccessful, right, in his lifetime. It's not like this sort of narrative of the charismatic leader sort of achieving goals, getting what he wants, is questioned by that sort of narrative itself. But even in the biblical text, at least I have an intuition that we recognize Moses is charismatic, right? Even if we don't have the images, we don't have the Hollywood story, there is still something very charismatic about this figure of Moses, and that's the kind of democratic charisma that I want to get at, to the sort of lying beneath the sort of authoritarian charisma that might be more at the surface. Authoritarian charisma would seem to leverage ideology, right? So it's Moses as a man, as white man, as American man, that makes him appealing, right? In the Hollywood representation. Our intuitions about moral exemplars may be distorted by authoritarian charisma. So if we're seeing if the moral exemplars that we're thinking about all also have charisma, but a lot of charisma is sort of organized by this sort of authoritarian pattern, which is leveraging ideology, then before we can begin our work of studying moral exemplars, we have to figure out how to peel back that kind of authoritarian charisma. What distinguishes moral exemplars is that we can press beyond authoritarian charisma and notice democratic charisma. So in not all cases will there be democratic, a lot of democratic charisma sort of lying beneath the authoritarian charisma, beneath the sort of function of circulating ideology. So with Hitler or something like that, right? There's not the characteristics of democratic charisma are not sort of there. It's just ideology all the way down. That's at least what I try to develop in the larger project. And the way this democratic charisma seems to work is to reveal the extraordinary and the ordinary. So Moses is just an ordinary person. He's not slick. He's not all polished, right? He stutters, right? His doesn't always succeed. He's relatively lowly, right? Right. Different stories have it slightly different ways, but still, even in the sort of realm of ordinary people, there is a sort of extraordinary potential that democratic charisma calls our attention to. At least that's what I'm trying to explore. And I have some theses. So I thought, instead of going into more detail on other examples, I sort of have these 10 rather gnomic theses to summarize the thing as a whole, in which I thought I would sort of share and see how that goes. Charisma is everywhere. Wherever we look, in the present or in the past, among elites or among ordinary people, among men or women, we find charisma. Charisma may look different, but the phenomenon itself is the same in all places, at all times. Political leaders can be charismatic, and so can neighbors, lecturers, and also aunts. Charisma expresses humanity. What draws us to someone who has charisma, that extraordinary gift of charisma, is humanity itself. When we can see who you are beyond what you are, you have charisma. We are intrigued, enchanted. Charisma is a supernatural gift, a gift from God, if you like, insofar as we are gifted with our humanity, insofar as the human exceeds the natural world. Wherever there is humanity, there is charisma. But most of the time, we forget about humanity, caught up in the inertia of the ordinary or in the structures of rationality. Charisma reminds. Charisma conceals or reveals. Revealing who you are beyond what you are requires toying with expectations. It means demonstrating the inadequacy of the concepts the world gives us. Some charisma exceeds expectations, displaying an excess of humanity, an excess of wisdom, an excess of beauty, an excess of goodness. This is authoritarian charisma. It gives an audience what they want and more. Such charisma promises to show the human, but it only offers an image of humanity, concealing the human. In contrast, democratic charisma reveals the human by juxtaposing the ordinary and extraordinary. Socrates was wise but ugly, spoke of abstract things but began with worldly things. Moses led a people, but he stuttered. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke with unmatched eloquence but was short. When we see the ordinary and extraordinary together, our expectations are short-circuited, and we know that the human exceeds all worldly categories. Democratic charisma pulls us beyond the world. The sleek, slick performance of authoritarian charisma makes us feel as if we are being pulled beyond the world when we are actually being tethered all the more tightly to the world. Mediation is essential to charisma. We encounter the human when we reach the limits of mediation. Authoritarian charisma pretends to transcend mediation to offer presence. The one who has charisma looks directly in your eyes, speaks directly to your heart. In fact, authoritarian charisma conceals mediation. even as charisma employs the various technologies of media, from the internet to the video recording, to newspapers, to rumors, to language itself. Democratic charisma calls attention to mediation and so reveals its limits. Moses did not speak directly to the masses. That was Charlton Heston. Moses mediated by Hollywood. Moses spoke to Aaron, who spoke to the Israelite elders, who spoke to the people. All hesitated, faltered, reminding the Israelites that something extraordinary was at work, irreducible to human categories. To communicate it in human categories would necessarily fail. Charisma circulates or short-circuits ideology. Charisma relies on mediation, and mediation carries the wisdom of the world. Mediation carries the ideas of the wealthy and the powerful. It makes them seem natural. Authoritarian charisma interpolates. By concealing mediation, by offering direct presence, the ideas of the wealthy and the powerful are communicated directly to us, become our ideas, become obvious. Authoritarian charisma solidifies the hold of patriarchy, homophobia, nationalism, xenophobia, and capitalism. Democratic charisma denaturalizes ideology. It makes us realize that the human cannot be reduced to what the world says it is, that we cannot be reduced to what the world says we are. Authoritarian charisma assures us that everything fits together smoothly and we fit in the world comfortably. Democratic charisma of the community organizer or religious genius, of Ella Baker or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, reminds us that something is amiss, prompting us to ask new questions over and over. Charisma establishes authority. We respond to charisma by ceding our ordinary judgment. We defer to one who possesses the extraordinary gifts that entail charisma. Authoritarian charisma uses this deference to its own advantage, molding the desires of followers to advance the self-interest of the charismatic, which coincides ultimately with the interests of the powers that be. Democratic charisma requires ceding our ordinary judgment in favor of an authority irreducible to the world, to the authority of critique. Democratic charisma teaches us that our intuitions, reasons, and affects fail to account for the human. We get the world wrong and we get ourselves wrong. The authority of democratic charisma motivates us to ask how and why, pulling us beyond the world in the direction of the true, the good, and the beautiful. Charisma conceals and reveals. We never encounter charisma that is purely democratic or purely authoritarian. Charisma that from one perspective conceals, from another perspective reveals. When Martin Luther King Jr. first began speaking about a bus boycott to the masses in Montgomery, Alabama, he had unmistakable oratorical gifts, but he was also just 26 years old, a new minister who had received his PhD a few months before. He was talented but not perfectly polished, calling attention to his own humanity. A decade later, King could not escape the mass-mediated image of himself. Time shifts the meaning of charisma. In other cases, differing contexts shift its meaning, or differing forms of mediation. Even in its ambivalence, charisma remains, at its essence, about the human. Objects may enchant and may circulate ideology, but objects cannot have charisma, not even icons, unless they mediate the charisma of a human, of one who is at once extraordinarily gifted and utterly ordinary. Charisma requires choice. While charisma requires deferring to an authority beyond the self, the fundamental ambivalence of charisma requires witnesses to judge. To which authority should I defer? To the authority of a particular person with an extraordinarily polished performance, or to something else beyond the world? Because of the ambivalence of charisma, we are always pulled in two directions when we encounter it, by gravity and by grace, by the world and against the world. Witnesses are called to judge and to choose. Charisma is contagious. Once you see the human in another, you notice the human in yourself. You realize you must be more than the sum of descriptions the world has for you, that you must somehow evade the categories given by the world. When the worker hears the labor organizer describe that there is more to workers than their bosses see, that workers can gain power by uniting together and fighting together, she recognizes the human in herself. Under the sway of charisma's authority, pulled beyond the world, she is compelled to speak up, too, attacking the people and forces that dehumanize her, displaying her humanity. She has caught charisma, and she will now pass it on to others. But the powers that be are strong, and they take advantage of charisma's ambivalence to halt the spread of democratic charisma with the temptations of authoritarian charisma. Charisma threatens violence, promises love. To see the human in the other is to love the other. Charisma at its best, democratic charisma. To be entranced by the other, by her polish, her extraordinary qualities, and so to defer to her, charisma at its worst, authoritarian charisma. In the latter case, the self is deformed for the sake of the other, the authority. In the former, the mysteries of other, self, and world intrigue. Socrates or the sophists. But the question is never so clear. Our first encounter with charisma is our first encounter with authority, and our first encounter with love, our parents. From the perspective of the child, the parent, as superhuman, as master of the normative order, deserves deference. Then we discover that the parent is ordinary, only to us extraordinary, the narrative engine of great literature and of life. We must learn to love properly, first the parent, then the teacher, then the political leader. We must learn to see the extraordinary and the ordinary at once, and so to see the human, to choose the human, democratic charisma. This we can learn best not from photogenic leaders, nor from clever tweeters, nor from self-help gurus, but from paradigms of charisma writ small. We learn to witness democratic charisma in the neighbor, in the cousin, in the community meeting, at the bus stop. There we learn to love. So I've been trying to think about more sort of sites of popular, how this relates to more sites of popular culture, and so I've written a bit about the Me Too movement and how that, how the sort of framework of charisma might help in thinking about the ambivalences of seduction and the violence that, sort of sexual violence that goes with that. Trump, of course, is charismatic, faith-based community organizing, and a few weeks ago, we had this op-ed in The Guardian thinking about the prison abolition movement as one that's part of an abolitionist tradition that draws on democratic traditions of democratic charisma and tries to sort of circulate that. And that's where my next work is going with my colleague Josh Dubler. We're doing a book on prison abolition and the sort of democratic charismatic background of that, but also the new manifestations of that. These days, as criminal justice reform is on everyone's minds. I think that's about 30 minutes. Thank you so much for your attention. I'm looking forward to questions. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. So this was really interesting. And I think at heart, if I understand you correctly, you're distinguishing between the charisma that presents a seductive image and a charisma that presents reality. Or gets at reality. But I just want to, so bracket that in case you don't agree with me, but I just want to make a couple observations about sort of how some of the things you said came across that I didn't know if you meant them to come across that way. Mm-hmm. So for instance, like, Charlton Heston, obviously, good looking, associate with, a lot of very charismatic figures who I would think of as bad people, like Napoleon, for instance. They weren't very good looking either, and Stalin. To me, so it wasn't, and I think that you can have bad charisma even in a good political ideology. You can have you can be advocating for good things, but still be presenting a false image of those good things, or a destructive image of those good things, because you're presenting a lie. And to me, the heart of the distinction between good and bad charisma is the sleek, right, the lie, whether, as opposed to I'm getting at something perhaps uncomfortable but real. And so I just wanted to, I mean, the very words authoritarian versus democratic, or I think you mentioned capitalist. To me that sounds like there's an additional layer on the distinction that you want to make, and I didn't know if you wanted that additional layer there or not, as in people who have good charisma won't affiliate with X, Y, or Z. Whereas to me, what I find most appealing is the distinction between a false presentation and an authentic or true presentation, a distortion versus a reality.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, and that's helpful in clarifying things. So I guess two main points that I'd make. So I mean, one, I think you're certainly pointing to the ambivalences of charisma, and that's exactly what I want to highlight, right? That I don't want to make a list of the good and the bad, right? Rather, I want to sort of help us develop skills for discerning ways in which we can be misled and ways in which we can be pulled toward something like goodness or truth or beauty. And I mean, as you're rightly pointing out, right? These are never sort of easily distinguishable, but I do think if we sort of reflect on instances when we can sort of clearly see ourselves being pulled in one direction or the other, we can sort of make ourselves more sensitive, better judges of this when we encounter it in the future. So I mean, with the sort of a subpoint with the examples of Napoleon and Stalin that you helpfully point out. Yeah, I mean, I think with all of these sorts of cultural examples, I'm not. There are no sort of necessary and sufficient conditions for sleekness of presentation or something like that. It looks different in every context, and from some angles, Martin Luther King, looks very polished. From other angles, he looks very unpolished. But those ambivalences are ones that I want to say we should attend to, right? And can be productive, even if there are always problematic aspects that accompany that. I mean, in terms of the basic characterization of deception versus reality. Yeah, I don't know. So, I mean, I think maybe my general sort of outlook on these things is such that I'm a negative theologian, right? I think it's much easier to say what God is not, what is not good, what is not true, than it is to say that this is the truth of the matter about worldly things, or this is the path that will get us to the truth of the matter. So I'm much more comfortable saying that the democratic charisma orients us, right, toward the good, rather than saying democratic charisma tells us things that are like lets us see things that are truthful or that are good. I would be much more comfortable talking about democratic charisma, helping us, getting rid of deceptions or fogginess. Then right, okay, and authoritarian charisma doing just the opposite. Too many hands. Yeah.
Two quick questions. First, it's really an impressive work, and I'm really glad you're doing it very timely and say. First, do you think charisma is a virtue? And then the second question is, you said charisma establishes authority, but the two types of charisma establish a different kind of authority. And thinking back to the example of Moses, Moses is treated as a kind of paragon, almost more than any other religious figure before Jesus Christ. I mean, I think Philo even says that, the Lord gave him the laws first in himself, and then he articulated them. And Moses is held up as sort of the paragon of paragons, right? So he establishes authority. So I guess what I wonder, the authoritarian democratic divide suggests, at least to me, that authoritarian charisma points the authority to the one who has charisma, and then latches it onto themselves. With the democratic charisma leads people, diffuses itself, you might say. So I guess what I'm wondering then is, if democratic charisma sort of diffuses authority in a way, is Moses really an example of it? Because I'm not sure that his authority, at least within that tradition, it never, he's always in the picture. The ladder is never kicked out from under him in a way. So Moses always is held up. It's not as if he's just there to mediate the law and then he just sort of steps aside. He's always held up, you know. So I guess the virtue, and then what do we do with Moses and the authority issue?
Thanks. Yeah, great question. So with Moses, I mean, it feels like cheating to just always fall back to the ambivalence of charisma, and even with a figure like Moses, right? Even if we're reading the biblical text, right, we're going through layers and layers of representations of Moses. So if I want to say democratic charisma is something that we can only find in the human themselves, and is always. There's always a sort of ambivalence when we're encountering it through mediation, when we're encountering Moses, or when Moses is being held up, or whatever, right? I mean, there's a sort of natural tendency towards authoritarianism that, or authoritarian charisma that enters there. But I mean, the general idea, right, about Moses is that, so it's a idiosyncratic way of using the term authority, right? So authoritarian charisma has, is about securing worldly authority. Democratic charisma is not about sort of being confident in your own authority or about anything in the world, but rather, in my negative theological idiom, being confident that there's some authority other than the world, right? That there's some, whether you call it critique or God or something like that, right? There's some, the world does not have the last say or does not have the last word. That's the kind of authority that I want to say comes with democratic charisma. On the virtue, yeah. So there's a chapter called The Virtue of Charisma. In a room of a bunch of people who have very technical ideas about what virtue is, I'm reluctant to commit myself to any position with respect to charisma as a virtue. But yeah, in some non-technical sense of virtue, I do want to say that, I want to say yes, right? That I must say there is a disposition that, is cultivated in community and is never unequivocal, but one can, and the recognizing of it and the performing of it go together. So one gets better at recognizing it and one gets better at performing it at the same time. That sort of contagion of the labor organizing meeting is sort of exemplary there. Yeah. Maybe I should do it in front. Yes, sir.
In terms of the deceptive activity that you talk about with authoritarian charisma, I'm wondering if you would attribute and mode to that in terms of Frankfurt's distinction between lying and bullshitting.
Yeah, that's interesting. So authoritarian charisma. I guess I would see, I think I'm working at a different sort of level, like with a different sort of set of questions. So I don't really care how sincerely held the beliefs of the authoritarian charismatic person are. I care about the effects of their charismatic performance and discerning those effects and discerning, what is it about the sort of package, right, that suggests a sleekness that conceals and that sort of naturalizes, ideology. So that the thoughts and beliefs of the person himself or herself.
Yeah, to follow up on that, it might become important if you go along with Frankfurt and think that bullshitting is more insidious, it's more effective. That maybe having those ideological effects on others.
Thanks. Yeah, I'll have to think more about that. Yeah. Is there? Yes, ma'am.
I'm still trying to figure out exactly how the distinction is made between authoritarian and democratic charisma. So I guess I'll frame the question in terms of, is there an evaluation that happens? Like we evaluate instances of charisma and determine whether or not it's authoritarian or democratic, partly in terms of ends perhaps that it's used to, or goals of the speaker, or is it a distinction we can make just by looking at the content of an instance of charisma? So I'm looking particularly at what I think he said about mediation, that democratic charisma turns attention to mediation, whereas authoritarian charisma hides it. So there you have an instance where, without having any conception of the good that I'm trying to evaluate what they're doing in terms of, I can just say, how are they doing this? Are they pointing the audience to the mediation, or are they trying to kind of assert authority via hiding any sort of mediation? And I'm not entirely, I'd be interested in what exactly is meant by that term, because I might be using it in my head in a different way from you. But what strikes me as interesting is if you're evaluating in terms of being able to really point to differences in content of instances of charisma, then you can take someone who has a morally good role, like you can look at Martin Luther King and really speak to the mix you're talking about, where you say, maybe generally speaking, we see instances of democratic charisma, but sometimes he's effective exactly because he takes up a tone, or there are instances of authoritarian charisma. So by removing an evaluative, kind of normative distinction being made between the two categories, I think you actually make space to really talk about the ambiguity you seem to be interested in.
Thank you. Yeah. So just by thinking about the sort of structure of revealing or concealing mediation, to take one example, that would allow you to see both happening in the same person, or something like that. Yeah. And I mean, I guess my inclination with I guess scholarly work in general is to provide tools for people to use as it's helpful, right? So if there's some distinctions that are useful, you can use them. If there's some distinctions that are not useful for whatever you want to do with them, you can set them aside. And reflecting on examples, and I think I think everyone has to mention Zygzebski once. So I think the Zygzebski work is useful in pointing us to the reminding us of the importance of meditating on these exemplary cases before sort of doing the sort of conceptual work. So I mean, that's all I sort of want to do, is to draw our attention to these sorts of examples of charisma, and then use that as a starting point to meditate on them, and offer some suggestions about various sets of distinctions one might make that may or may not be useful. Yes.
You probably have time for one more question.
Oh, sure. Yes, sir.
Thanks. I had a question about the second thesis.
I should have called them theses of philosophy.
So I think you said that, so when we can see who you are beyond what you are, so when we can see your humanity, you have charisma. And I was just wondering whether it might be the case that sometimes the ability to see the humanity in others tells us something more about the perceiver than it does about the person that's being perceived. So it seems that some people just are better at perceiving who others are rather than what they are. Or some people are just better at perceiving the humanity in others. And an explanation for that might not be that the people they're perceiving are, it might not be that they're better at perceiving charisma, it's just that they're better at perceiving humanity. So I guess it seemed like the ability to see who you are rather than what you are might sometimes be a feature of the perceiver rather than telling something about the charismaticness of the person being perceived.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's a nice question, and I think that Peter Voss and I are both inspired by Kierkegaard to some extent in this, in going in this direction. Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of thesis, it was 8 or 9 or something like that about the contagion of charisma, right? I mean, I want to say the more that one can see beyond the surface characteristics of another, right, to who they are rather than what they are, the more one starts noticing that in oneself, and so starts performing the sort of democratic charisma, again, always ambivalently, the more others notice that from you. So I do want to say that there's a kind of chain reaction there that is not the only way that we can perceive others well, and is not the only dimension of right perception, but is one that relates to charisma and may be useful to think about. Okay, thank you. Yes.